Good evening and welcome to Iowa News and Views. My name is Joe Balcom. I'm the host of the program. Thanks for joining us. Iowa News and Views is a statewide public access TV program. In fact, we're a bona fide news interview program. We've been on since last February. That'd be February of 1997. We've been producing a show that goes out to 15 different communities, and we hope you tell your friends about us as you tune in. We're seen in about 375,000 households, and essentially we're all volunteers that have been producing this show. Remember, no flipping tonight. We have a great show. We're going to be talking about education in Iowa from the perspective of the Latino community and issues faced by Hispanics in Iowa as they try and address education issues and prepare for the future and prepare for good paying jobs and good quality of life. Education is certainly an issue for all of us in Iowa, but it's a particular concern to the Latino community. We have with us two people, Bob Mata, who is the Program Director of Equity for the Davenport Community Schools, and John Paul Chaisson, who is the actually currently the chair of the Iowa Commission on Latino Affairs, and we're pleased to have you both with us.
Thank you very much for having us here.
I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the demographics that we see nationally and in the state of Iowa. And it's been indicated that by the year 2000, just 2 years from now, about 40% of school-age population will be children of color. By 2010, Hispanics and Latinos will be the largest minority group, which is a significant fact. And in the next 50 years, Hispanics will make up about 25% of the U.S. population. In Iowa, the growth in school-age children of color has also been increasing among Asians, Native Americans, Hispanics, and of course blacks. Between 1990 and 1995 in Iowa, we saw a substantial increase in the number of Hispanic students from 5.4% to 6.8%. And in 1996, just 1 year later, that grew by a whole percentage point. So we see a growing number of Hispanic students in Iowa. And tonight we're going to be talking about how we're doing as a state addressing issues that face that community. John Paul, when we talk about Hispanics and Latinos, we're using labels, and maybe you could give us a little background on those terms and how we should be thinking about those.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having us on your show. It's a wonderful opportunity to speak to the Iowa community. One of the things that a lot of people ask me as a Latino and a person who doesn't fit the stereotype of a Latino is, what does a Latino mean? And a lot of people are confused between the labels of Hispanic and Latino. For me, I'm going to backtrack a little bit, and I'm going to tell you exactly when I learned what Hispanic was. I learned what Hispanic was. I came to the United States my junior year in high school, actually a little bit before. And in order to come into the United States and for them to put me in a grade which was adequate for me, they wanted to test me. But they didn't have they didn't have a set of tests specifically to place people in their grade when it was a different language. So they gave me a standardized test, and during that there was a section where they were reading it to me in Spanish so I could answer the little boxes. And they put boxes, and there was African American, black, Asian American, and then there was Hispanic and white. And I was looking at myself, and I'm looking at myself, I'm from Guatemala, and I'm white. So I'm like circling it, and the teacher physically picked up my hand and moved it over to the Hispanic slot. That day is when I learned what a Hispanic was. In Guatemala, there's no such concept as Hispanic. And when we look at a historical perspective of that, Hispanic is not a word that's been around for a long time. It started off in right around 1848 when the United States took over 1/3 of the population of the landmass of Mexico, which is now the United States, or part of the United States of Mexico that used to be Mexico and now is the United States. That went up to Utah almost. So it's a large chunk. And there was two groups of people which were in that area specifically. One was the Ladino, or the very rich Spanish descendants who wanted to separate themselves from what they called the common Mexican. So what they did is they gave themselves the name Hispanics. But as future has it and history in the United States has it, well, they lost their land anyway. So that term disappeared until 1970, when the U.S. Census decided they needed a label for this population of people which they hadn't given to it, which is Hispanic.
I see.
Latino, on the other hand, it's not a good label because it comes from the Roman Empire, Latino, but it's a self-given label. And I think there's certain power between something that's taken as a name and something that is given as a name.
I see. Interesting. So what about Mexican American as another term that we hear? Bob, do you have any, is that another provided for label?
I think when you get to the point of looking at the various points of origin for the Latino population in the United States, I think that's where you start getting labels such as Mexican American or Puerto Riqueño or Cuban or whatever. And there was there's that time when everything was hyphenated American.
Right.
And so I really think that that's where we have come and where we are at this point. But again, so much of that is political more than it is cultural.
Sure. Yeah, I know there's been a number of forums on race here in Johnson County recently, and that the terms have been talked about. I heard Julian Bond speak, who's the head of the NAACP last week, and he was saying he preferred the term black. And others prefer the term African American. And it's a very personal thing, but it's also has this political piece to it as well.
I agree. And something that people forget about the Latinos in the United States or Hispanics in the United States is that we're not a homogenous group by any means. We have, 32 different countries that we're looking at. We have kind of some countries in the Caribbean. And there's a huge amount of difference between even people within one country, Mexico, the northern part of Mexico and southern part of Mexico. Absolutely. And then if you add Cuban Americans or Puerto Rican Americans or Central American Americans, we're nothing alike. We just have a common set of goals and needs that we're trying to meet.
We're very diverse, and I was not going to be immune from addressing issues of diversity in terms of as our population continues to grow, and specifically as relates to the whole area of employment. I mean, right now in Iowa we have a shortage of skilled and people, and we have a shortage of people. And some of the growth that we're going to need to see our state grow is going to be from people from other places, it seems to me. Bob, you're involved in equity programming with the Davenport School District, and John Paul used to be the equity coordinator for the West Liberty schools. Bob, what's involved in equity coordination or the programmatic piece of what you do in your work?
A major piece of the work of the equity director for the Davenport schools is to oversee a series of initiatives called All Children Excel, or Project ACE, which is, as I say, a series of initiatives that take in about 6 or 7 areas that are very specific, targeted goals, objectives, action planning areas. Everything from affirmative action to curriculum, to special education, attendance, number of areas. So we have been collecting data in each of those areas, and we've been giving information back to each school site, so that when you're looking at educational opportunity, you're identifying just, well, who is our population that we're serving? And sometimes numbers, that kind of data can be surprising to the very people who have been in buildings for quite some time. And so what we're looking at is, how are we doing? Are we getting better? What is our responsibility as we look at the changing dynamics of a population of students in a relatively urban district like Davenport, where at this point in time, district-wide, Davenport is probably 28% students of color.
Wow.
And so, you're talking a district of a little over 17,500 students. And it's growing. It grows every year. We've been watching that growth over time, and it's been steadily increasing, and it will continue to increase because it truly is mirroring what is happening to society as a whole in the United States.
Sure.
So, interestingly enough, the statistics of the student population in Davenport doesn't necessarily mirror the statistics of the population as a whole in the community around the Quad Cities. So again, you are looking at through job job analyses and labor market analyses and those kinds of things is what is happening, what is bringing a truly richer diversity of people into the Davenport, the Quad City area, and what industries in particular are we paying more attention to, and how does that impact the schools?
Sure.
So it's just a piece of the equity area.
Is the equity work in West Liberty similar, John Paul? Or is it more focused in different ways?
West Liberty had a very interesting situation. It's a small town, and it's a small district of about 1,500, 1,600 students. However, its population was right around 36-37% Latino. It's there's about 2% Asian American, and then 37% Latino, and then the rest is what we would consider white Caucasian. So the needs are a little bit different. However, the issues that we're dealing with are the same. So are we getting staff, or I used to deal with, are we getting staff of color in there? People who are Latinos in there. Presently, there's only one person who's a teacher who is a minority person.
Interesting. So. There's been a lot of discussion about education in Iowa, that we have we may have a special legislative session coming up here. In terms of the legislation that we've seen at the state level, we're going to be talking about some of these issues in a second. How are we doing as a state addressing education issues for the Latino community? Kind of a hot topic. And I should note, John Paul is here as while he serves as chair of the Commission on Latino Affairs, he's here speaking for himself this evening, not for the commission. I want to note that.
Thank you. Some of the issues I think that have not been dealt with is the enforcement of the multicultural, non-sexist part of education. There's a lot of districts that are still not looking at that as something that is a very important component of the education, of the educational environment, especially in those districts which are heavily minority weighted. But it's also very important in those districts that are not, because a lot of those students are not going to stay in their home communities, which is mainly homogenous, but they're going to move into communities, and a lot of people are leaving Iowa these days. A lot of our youth are leaving Iowa into communities which are very diverse. How are they going to function there? And I think it's part of the mission of our schools to look at it.
One of the things that, maybe it's time to talk about this a little bit, some of the statistics on Iowa. We have about 11,618 students, K through 12, in terms of the schools. We have no superintendents in any of the school districts that are Hispanic or Latino. Only 4 principals out of 1,158 in those schools. 2 guidance counselors out of 1,329. We have 114 Hispanic Latino teachers out of more than 33,000. 114 out of 33,000. 5 Hispanic coaches out of almost 3,000, and 7 assistant coaches out of about a little more than 1,700. Seems like we've got some work to do on some of these things. Why is it important for us to have more Hispanic and Latino educators in our schools addressing some of these issues?
First of all, I want to make a preface. Those seem like the data that came from the 1995-1996 school year.
So we might be doing a little better.
So we might not.
Okay.
I do not know.
Right.
However, I do believe that there is a question of who are the role models. And for the minority students who are in those districts, which are 37, 36, 24% minority or Latino across the state, who are the natural advocates? It's very hard sometimes to teach something that you're not naturally, have not experienced naturally. For example, how do you teach Latin American literature class? And you can learn a lot about the culture, and that is very given. But there's something human about experiencing the stories that go along the side with it. And again, if we look at the issues of if our students are in very homogeneous areas, is there a benefit to having a teacher who's culturally different than them, just for exposure reasons?
Sure.
It's also a matter too that that while we know that the larger percentage of Latinos in Iowa are pretty much concentrated in specific areas of the state, the reality of it is that the issues that are facing, for example, the larger urban districts in Iowa are issues very similar to communities that are very small, like you were saying, like West Liberty, like a Storm Lake, etc. And yet, you know, again, if we're experiencing difficulty in the hiring of personnel in larger districts, imagine the difficulty that small districts have to become out of desire, not only the desire, but, you know, to become more representative of the population being served.
Sure.
So
good point.
It is really, and unfortunately, it's almost like a catch-22 because you have cases where, or situations where you don't even have enough individuals in those programs preparing to become educators, and then those that are, then are very, it's a very, very marketable place to be, and in some cases, because many of the districts in Iowa do not offer some of the incentives such as districts in Texas and California do, financial and otherwise, you see a percentage leave Iowa for a number of reasons.
Sure. You're watching Iowa News and Views. We're at midpoint, or actually we're a little beyond midpoint. My name's Joe Balcom. We're visiting with Bob Mata, who is the Director of Program Director of Equity, I'm sorry, for the Davenport Community Schools, and John Paul Chaisson, who is the chair currently of the Iowa Commission on Latino Affairs. We're pleased to have you both with us. We're talking about education issues in Iowa, dealing with the Latino community. So how, it sounds like getting teachers is a big deal. I mean, if the incentives might not be there, it also sounds like we're not doing a very good job providing opportunities in our higher educations of learning to prepare more teachers. It seems like the statistics in that area, we don't have a lot of Latino folks getting ready to be teachers, much less the incentives to keep them. How do we address that?
Well, a good share of addressing begins at looking at what we have around and among us. And within many of our communities, we really could be looking and doing more of what's normally called grow your own kinds of situations, where you're giving opportunities to people who may be in paraprofessional situations right now, paraeducators or otherwise, in support services areas, to offer the incentive of going back to school and or going to school to increase. We do know that that the linkages that are necessary between the 2- and the 4-year colleges and universities are very critical pieces when it comes to working with students of color, because not only in Iowa but across the country, the largest percentage of Latinos in school are in 2-year colleges and programs. So what happens is, not only do you look at the transfer related issues, courses and otherwise, but are people getting information to move forward? Constantly getting that information, keeping it in front of them, saying, yes, you can go on. You can achieve those goals. And this is, so, and there are some financial incentives for you to continue that. And come home, come back, to, be of service back to your community.
That's good. John Paul, is that a local community problem, or is there a state angle to this question of how we provide incentives and provide support for those folks, say, in community colleges that might want to go on to a University of Iowa or a Northern Iowa University to get a teaching certificate?
There are certain things that Latinos a lot of times have that could be considered assets and values, and sometimes are not used as such. For example, language ability. People should be rewarded for having a language ability other than their own. And a lot of times we don't think of that as something that's marketable or that can have a monetary value behind it. That is one way of looking at it. A second thing that can be looked at is culture. The similarity of culture is shown through the research to affect the relationship, especially in the social sciences, but also in education, between both the person who's receiving the services and the person who is giving them, the way you establish rapport. The question is state and national. It's also very local. One of the things I think we need to start looking at is ways to develop our own people in our own communities and put them through programs. There's some statistics here that I find very interesting. I found that in 1996, and this is off a report, diversification, report on the diversity in the educational personnel in Iowa, which comes out of the Department of Education. And it said that only 90 out of 13,888 people in education majors were actually Latinos. And then that only 17 out of the 31 post-secondary education programs in the state had any people of color in them. So we're not putting them through. We're not creating the pool that we're going to need in the future, especially if the population is growing. So,
Bob, how's Davenport Community Schools doing with affirmative action on these kinds of questions in terms of recruitment and the like?
In spite of the fact that this year has been a tough one for us as a district because we are going through some financial reorganization as well in the district, we still set a goal this year to increase the number of persons who fit all affirmative action categories in the Davenport schools by up to 20% of the total staff, and in particular certificated staff. So that is a goal that we're looking at hopefully to achieve within the hiring that is going on at present for the district. So definitely a focus there. And you had asked or kind of stated earlier on in about the importance of having a model, a picture. And that's not to say that people cannot have a sensitivity for and have that within. But that also says something, it also says something about a child who looks at a person, a classroom teacher, and says inside of himself or herself, I can be just like you. And
that's an excellent point.
And the more we have the faces in front of children, the better we're going to be in terms of those kind of opportunities. And where else? Public schools are the first place where you get that kind of diverse opportunity. I mean, that in a child's life, that's really your first place. So why not continue to promote that and make it a natural part, not just ethnicity, culture, but a number of categories and styles.
Good point. Yeah, I think we can all think of teachers that we've had that have been kind of that person up on the pedestal, that role model that helped us understand something or kind of helped us find out who we are. And that's really critical to this. The other thing that's critical about this is that if we don't address these issues as a state, I would say these are not just problems of the Latino community, they're problems of our entire community. Having people become well-educated, being able to become involved not in the community through social and economic ways is going to be good for us in the long run economically and quality of life in our state. And it's not going to be acceptable to leave people behind. John Paul, in terms of your work now, what kinds of things should people be doing in the community to make some headway on these issues?
There's so much to do. There's so much to do, but that's the beauty of it also, that there's a lot of things people can do, very small things and large, grand scale things. For example, one of the things that the community and the state needs to do, and the community even here in Iowa City needs to do, is start knowing who other people are. For example, how you're expanding your network, who are you talking to? Latinos in Iowa City a lot of times have the same issues as those in Davenport, and those in Sioux City, and those in Des Moines. But we're not talking to each other.
So more communication. Bob, any final points? We're getting down to the last minute or two here.
As John Paul was visiting about that, I was thinking that it really is important that we continue the linkages, the partnerships, and primarily not just within the Latino community, not just there. We all, but there is that issue of even within the Latino community that we all carry that responsibility to be a part of the process, because we must advocate for all children, even for especially for those who cannot advocate for themselves. So that is a responsibility for every Latino in the state of Iowa.
So getting organized, it's a good message to leave it on. We've been talking with John Paul Chaisson and Bob Mata, two people working in Iowa to address education issues and issues and concerns of the Latino community. We are glad you have joined us. We'll be back again next week. I'd like to thank our contributors for making it possible, of course the crew and the viewers in all those 15 places around the state, our local sponsors that make it possible for us to be on. Remember, this is just a TV program. What's important is what you're doing each and every day in your community to make it a better place. Bob's working on it, John Paul's working on it. It's your turn next. We've got some work to do as we've seen here tonight. So we'll see you again next time. Thanks.